On the evening of Friday, January 30th, 2004, hundreds of spectators gathered at the cinema in the center of the small town of Holland, Michigan. The theater was showing a series of popular films, but nothing like this had been seen here before. A group of high school students had presented a film they had worked on for 4 months. Its creation had stirred up a lot of emotions in the town, and the audience was eagerly awaiting the screening. Finally, the exciting moment arrived. The lights dimmed, and the opening credits appeared on the screen. The room filled with the enchanting sounds of a piano, followed by the captivating singing of a girl. One viewer, a police officer, watched what was happening on the screen with special interest, not missing a single detail. His mind was working intensely. When the film ended, the audience couldn't move, immersed in what they had just witnessed. Meanwhile, 130 kilometers away from the thunderous applause in the theater, one man was doing the same thing he did every evening. He filled a glass and drank it, trying to find oblivion at the bottom. 25 years before this, on Wednesday, January 31st, 1979, just past 2 o'clock in the morning, the phone rang at the Holland City Police Station. It was a resident of the local Blue Mill Motel who had reason to believe that a robbery had occurred. He was talking on the phone with the night porter when he heard a male voice demanding money. The responding police officers quickly determined that around $500 had disappeared from the registration desk and the office. The night porter, 22-year-old Janet Chandler, was also nowhere to be found. Her purse had vanished, her coat was hanging on a chair, and an unfinished cigarette lay in the ashtray. The likelihood that the young woman had left the motel on her own was ruled out because January was the coldest month in Michigan, and that night it was snowing heavily. She wouldn't have gone out into the cold without her coat. It was more likely that someone had taken her in a car, since there were 2 sets of footprints leading from the motel entrance into the snow. The tire tread marks confirmed it was an off-road vehicle. All evidence pointed to Janet being abducted by the robber, who probably ordered her to take her purse, assuming there might be money or other valuables inside. This scenario left the small-town police, which had never dealt with kidnappings before, baffled. It was winter and the tourist season had not yet started, but the motel was full due to a strike at a nearby factory. To protect the factory property and the employees who wanted to continue working, the factory had hired a security firm, and all 80 security guards were staying at the motel. However, despite the large number of residents, there were no witnesses to the abduction. The police knew how important it was to work quickly if they wanted to find Janet alive, but they had no idea where to begin the search. Nonetheless, they quickly positioned patrol cars on the roads to prevent anyone from leaving town unnoticed. The search for the abducted girl began. In the early hours of January 31st, Jim and Glenna Chandler were awakened by a phone call. It was a police officer who briefly explained the situation to Janet's parents. They vehemently dismissed the notion that their daughter might have run away with someone. If Janet had disappeared in the middle of her shift without explanation, something terrible must have happened. Jim Chandler blamed himself for everything. He had recently visited his daughter at work and noticed individuals at the motel whom he strongly disliked. Now he regretted not asking his daughter who they were. Overall, Jim and Glenna believed that their daughter might have found part-time work elsewhere. She had previously studied nursing and worked with children, which suited her personality better. But Janet was eager to earn money and gain some independence. Moreover, her best friend and roommate, Lori Ann Swank, worked at the motel. Therefore, after careful consideration, her parents concluded that their daughter was mature and sensible enough to make the right decisions. Around 1:30 a.m. on February 1st, a snowplow driver was clearing a road about 50 kilometers south of Holland. When his headlights caught a snow-covered turnoff to a neighboring town, he noticed something strange: tire tracks leading into dense wooded terrain. The driver got out of his vehicle into the frigid air and followed the tracks, which led him to a snowdrift. There, beneath a tree, a horrifying scene unfolded before him. It was Janet Chandler. She had been subjected to brutal violence and strangled, most likely with a rope, wire, or belt. Her hands and feet were bound, and her mouth was sealed with tape, but there were no ropes or tape found on or near her body. All of her personal belongings, including her purse, jewelry, watch, and driver's license, were missing. She had been killed 6 hours before her body was discovered, but her body had been left in the snow shortly before the snowplow driver arrived. This case was beyond the capabilities of the town's police force. Therefore, dozens of law enforcement officers were dispatched from Michigan to coordinate the search in the area where Janet was found. Helicopters and search teams scoured the area. Rewards were offered for any information about the crime, and motorists were asked to report any suspicious vehicles in the vicinity where the girl was left. At the same time, the police interviewed Janet's relatives and friends. The college student had no enemies. She was passionate about music and aspired to sing in the opera one day. She had grown up in a loving family and most of her friends were from the church. Although she had dated guys, her family stated that she had not been in any serious relationships. They couldn't recall a single person who would want to harm her. 2 weeks later, the strikes at the factory came to an end, and all the security guards dispersed to their homes. The town became much quieter, but the investigation continued. The reward was increased to $3,000. The police re-interviewed colleagues, friends, and family of the girl, as well as motel residents. There was no hint as to who might have targeted the girl and why. Could she have become a random victim of a stranger? This case remained a mystery and was put on the back burner, although the officers couldn't completely forget about it. Janet's photo always remained pinned to the board in the police station, in the hope that her killer would be found someday. David Schock, a professor at Hope College, always impressed his students with interesting creative assignments. As a former journalist, he believed it would be beneficial for his students to establish good relations with law enforcement agencies. So, in 2003, Professor Schock organized a meeting with a detective from the Holland police for a group of 8 students. During the meeting, the professor asked the detective if there was a case he dreamt of solving. Without hesitation, the detective pointed to the photo of Janet Chandler that had been pinned to the board in the police station for over 20 years. An idea immediately popped into the professor's head. What if his students created a documentary film about Janet's life? They could interview her family and the people who worked on the case. Ideally, this could help uncover new leads, and even if it didn't, it would still be an interesting educational tool for the students and a way to honor the memory of the brutally murdered girl. The project got the green light, and the professor quickly got his students involved in the work, arranging interviews. One of the students, 21-year-old Sarah Hatman, was excited to work on the film but nervous about the prospect of interviewing the victim's parents. However, when they met Jim and Glenna Chandler in their home, their anxiety quickly dissipated. The elderly couple proved to be very welcoming and friendly, despite their own grief. They fondly spoke about their daughter, reminiscing about various moments in her life, like when neighbors gathered under their windows to listen to Janet sing. Despite the passage of 24 years, they still grieved deeply, and as elderly individuals, they believed they might not live to see their daughter's killer brought to justice. It didn't take long for the students to become personally invested in the case. They spoke with those who knew Janet, and the more they learned about her, the more they wanted to uncover the truth. 4 months later, the documentary film Who Killed Janet Chandler was presented to the public. The chief of the local police was also in the audience, unable to contain his emotions. A quarter of a century ago, he had been a young officer, and now, seeing Janet's family appeal for justice, he felt obligated to take action. He reached out to the Michigan State Police, and they agreed to reopen the case. By April 2004, a team led by David Van Lopik, a detective who had grown up in Holland and remembered the case well, had been officially formed. Despite technological advancements, there was no DNA or fingerprints to work with. However, they were determined to examine every lead, every hint about the perpetrator. The documentary painted a vivid picture of Janet's life, but it was just the tip of the iceberg. By learning who Janet truly was, beyond what her parents and teachers had said, they hoped to find the crucial clue they needed. Using the documentary as a tool, investigators hoped to compel people to talk. Digging a bit deeper, investigators unexpectedly discovered that shortly after Janet enrolled in college, something happened that shook her faith. She was seduced by an older man. Although she had always regarded intimate relationships before marriage as a sin, she decided to cross that line with him. Soon, they were regularly meeting at her parents' house when they were not at home. Their relationship continued for over a year, and Janet's parents never found out. But the relationship permanently changed her. She realized she could sin and not be punished for it. Her world began to change as she pushed the boundaries she had once tried so hard to uphold. Feeling that he was onto something, David Van Lopik turned to the person who knew Janet best, her best friend, Lori Swank. Lori had left town shortly after the murder and severed all ties with her former acquaintances. Lori fondly remembered Janet as a talented musician, but under pressure, she admitted that her friend was not so innocent. During their time working at the motel, the girls didn't always behave impeccably and became involved with the motel's security guards, who loved to host parties in the rooms. Sometimes things got out of control. Once, Janet invited one of the security guards to the registration desk. When he went downstairs, she was waiting for him in the neighboring office, wearing only cowboy boots. Lori, who was officially her supervisor, had to reprimand her. The detective increasingly realized that the motel in January 1979 was a place where wild parties never ceased. This meant that the crime could have been committed by someone with a connection to it. Investigators compiled a list of motel guests. Most of them were security guards who had left town after the strike, and as a result, the police had never interviewed them. Finding them 25 years later was not easy. Some barely remembered Janet because they had come to Holland to work, not to have fun. Detectives showed them the documentary film, hoping to jog their memories, but in most cases, it was futile. That was the case until Harry Kitt watched the film. Harry worked as a security guard but was also an amateur photographer. While watching the film, he recognized one of the pictures of Janet, which he had taken himself. And it wasn't just one picture. Harry retrieved an old album with photos from parties. In one photo, Janet was sitting on the lap of a security guard, holding a glass and wearing his uniform. It turned out to be none other than Robert Lynch, the very guest who had reported the robbery. In 1979, Lynch was nearly 40 years old. Due to his age, he rarely attended parties. Over the past 25 years, he managed to get married, become the father of 2 children, and open a beauty school with his wife. Detectives found him in the small town of Three Oaks, located 130 kilometers south of Holland. There was no reason to believe that the now 65-year-old Lynch, a law-abiding citizen, had any connection to the crime. However, pictures of Harry indicated that the two definitely knew each other. Furthermore, after listening to a recording of a man's call to the police, detectives had new questions. The man reported an ongoing robbery, but his voice lacked any emotion. Could the call have been staged? However, talking to Lynch was not easy. He provided evasive answers and claimed to have a poor memory of that period of his life. This, by the way, was easy to believe considering how often he turned to alcohol. Without any evidence, they couldn't connect him to the crime. Yet when interrogating other people, investigators kept circling back to Lynch. Maybe it was just a hunch, but they couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more than he was letting on. But how to approach him? He appeared to be a model family man with no legal problems, but his addiction to alcohol indicated a desire to forget something. Detectives hoped that if they continued to press him, cracks would appear in his armor. Their strategy paid off. In June 2005, Lynch finally admitted that he had entered into a relationship with Janet, despite the fact that he was 17 years older than her. Lynch also recalled that on the day of the murder, Janet attended a party that went awry. He stated that he didn't know anything more, but for the investigators, this was a significant revelation. Despite many years and several interrogations, this was the first time they had heard about such a party. Still convinced that Lynch knew more than he was saying, Detective Van Lopik visited him again a few months later. He was accompanied by a colleague known for expertly conducting interrogations and had a reputation for breaking even the most resilient suspects. This time, Van Lopik brought his secret weapon, a film. Lynch watched with difficulty as Janet's father spoke about his daughter, holding back tears. The detective paused the film, turned to Lynch and said, "You have children, don't you? Do you remember that one time when you took them somewhere and lost them? Do you remember that growing sense of fear inside you? Your daughter is the same age Janet was. If she were murdered, wouldn't you want to know the truth?" Tears welled up in Lynch's eyes. It took 4 months and 18 interrogations for Lynch to finally reveal what happened at the off-kilter party. Shortly before 2 a.m. on January 31st, 1979, Lynch and another security guard, James Nelson, descended to the first floor. Janet was working at the registration desk. James informed Janet that they were throwing a surprise party in her honor. She was told it would take place in a guest house on the factory premises where the head security guard, Arthur Carl Paiva, was stationed. The men restrained Janet's hands behind her back and placed handcuffs on her. According to Lynch, Janet didn't object. She also allowed them to blindfold her. The idea to create the appearance of a robbery belonged to Lynch. While Janet couldn't see, the men took all the cash and led her to a car parked outside. Several other security guards and motel maids were on the balcony, watching as the guards led Janet outside. They were well aware of the plan the men intended to carry out. Once they had taken Janet away, Lynch called 911 and reported a robbery. Afterward, he returned to his room and went to sleep, preparing for his shift at the factory. When he left work around 6 p.m., he quickly freshened up and went to join the other conspirators. There were already 15 to 20 guests present, including 6 women. Janet was among them. Completely naked, she sat on the couch, staring into nothingness. Her hands were bound and her mouth was sealed with tape. The people around her were joyfully celebrating. Then a few people exchanged glances as if suggesting to continue her humiliation. A security guard named Freddie Parker fastened his belt around Janet's neck and led her upstairs to a bedroom. Several other men followed them. They threw Janet on the bed, covering her eyes with tape. Around half a dozen men took turns tormenting her. The decision about who was allowed to participate was made by Arthur Paiva. It was his idea to tighten the belt around her neck, intensifying her suffering. Nelson, Lynch, and Parker followed his example. They strangled Janet with the belt to ensure she had no strength to resist. None of the 20 guests did anything to stop them. Instead, they encouraged and cheered on the attackers. Among them was Janet's best friend, Lori, who shouted insults at her while watching her ordeal. Lynch was the last to climb onto Janet and pinned her to the bed with his knees. He whispered obscenities to her, struck her, and tightened the belt even tighter. His memory of what happened next was hazy. Someone shouted that Janet wasn't breathing. Realizing that Janet was dead, the men panicked. Arthur threw a chair against the wall and yelled that the party was over. Incredibly, upon learning of what had just happened upstairs, all the other guests rushed to clean up the crime scene. They knew the police were already searching for Janet, and they needed to get rid of her quickly. They removed the tape from Janet's mouth, washed her, wrapped her in a sheet, and placed her in a car. Under the cover of night, Lynch drove about 40 miles north, parked the car on the side of the road, and left Janet's body in a snowdrift. 2 weeks later, the strike ended, and the security guards had no reason to stay in town. The men dispersed, swearing never to speak of what happened in the town. Many of them never crossed paths again. But Janet's murder haunted Lynch wherever he went. He began to drink, desperately trying to erase that night from his memory. Now, knowing what happened to Janet, investigators were even more tormented by the question, why? What compelled all these people to kill Janet in the most brutal way possible? Armed with Lynch's confession, detectives went to Lori Swank. They couldn't fathom how Janet's best friend not only witnessed the abuse, but also encouraged it. When pressured, Lori had to admit that she had been part of the plan from the beginning. It all began when Janet started dating a security guard who had also been involved with one of the motel maids. The betrayed girl was furious, and she and Janet had a loud argument about it. Lori herself was in love with Arthur, and it upset her to see Janet spending time with him too. She was angry and wanted revenge. Lori told Arthur that he wasn't the only one Janet was involved with, which infuriated him. After talking to other security guards and motel maids who were also resentful of Janet, they devised a plan to humiliate her and teach her a lesson. They all believed she had gotten too conceited and needed to be put in her place. After Lynch and Lori's confessions, the other partygoers at the gathering stopped keeping quiet. In total, it took the investigative team 2.5 years to uncover the whole truth. They were astonished by one thing: how many people were involved in the crime or its cover-up and had kept silent for nearly 30 years. It seemed incredible that no one had confessed earlier. Former motel maids claimed that the men had threatened them, and one woman was allegedly visited regularly by them to ensure her silence. There was also another possible explanation for their silence. Purportedly, incriminating photos of everyone present at the party existed, and Arthur would use them to blackmail any potential informants. However, if such photos existed, they were never found. Despite the involvement of around 12 people in the planning or immediate violence, prosecutors only charged 6 of them: Lynch, Lori, Arthur, Nelson, Parker, and Anthony Williams, based on the most reliable testimonies. All the men, except for Lynch, claimed that they were not at the party in the guest house and had no connection to the crime. Lynch himself sought forgiveness from Janet's parents and confessed everything in court in exchange for a second-degree murder charge. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison. However, he couldn't testify against the other accomplices due to dementia that developed as a result of alcohol abuse. In exchange for a second-degree murder charge, Lori provided testimony against the others. On October 17, 2007, Lori detailed step-by-step everything that had happened, from the planning to the execution. She didn't withhold anything, fully admitting her role in the conspiracy. She confessed that jealousy had driven her because Janet was more popular among men than she was. Since there were no physical evidence, the case heavily relied on Lori's testimony, but her words were backed up by 2 motel maids who knew about the plan and were at the party, and Arthur's former girlfriend, a factory worker who participated in the strike, provided him with an alibi. The women remembered how dreadful Janet looked. She was terrified while the men took turns abusing her. Occasionally, she would regain consciousness and try to escape. The rest of the time, she sat with a vacant stare as if she had been given some kind of prohibited substances. However, toxicological analysis didn't find anything unusual in her system. This vacant stare was likely a physical reaction to shock. On November 1st, the jury found all 4 guilty and sentenced them to life in prison. After the trial, Jim Chandler stated that, as a Christian, he might have forgiven the men, but for that to happen, they needed to ask for forgiveness, and none of these arrogant individuals had shown remorse or asked for forgiveness. Glenna added that she felt sorry for the parents and families of the men, but not for the men themselves. All the appeals from the convicted were denied. In 2016, Lori was released on parole after serving her sentence. Arthur died in prison after serving only 5 years. In June 2020, Nelson passed away. As for the students who worked on the documentary film Who Killed Janet Chandler, nothing could have prepared them for what transpired as a result of their project. However, they admit that it taught them to value life much more. Their creative inspiration, Professor Shook, left teaching and founded the company Deferred Justice, dedicated to shedding light on other unsolved crimes. His company has already succeeded in securing convictions in another murder case. Striving for justice and closure for families, Shook operates on the principle that someone knows something. There's always someone who knows something.